Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Should we just ask someone who knows a whole lot about the legislative roles when it comes to cybersecurity?
That's brilliant. Let's do that.
Let's do that. We're so pleased to welcome Senator Mark Warner, who is, of course, chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, who is joining us, I believe, from Washington, from Capitol Hill today. We'll give him just a second to get cameras turned on and all that. Fantastic conversation about sort of what senators and congressmen need to be thinking about in terms of how we legislate moving forward with cyber. Okay. We'll get just one second. Senator, we have audio from you, but we don't have your camera online yet.
You don't have my camera? It's let's see, share.
There may be.
Hold on. Being a technical genius here, I just as somebody that invented cell phones, or at least claims to, I should be able to turn at this point a year into COVID on figuring these things out, but I still stumble a lot.
Oh my goodness. Well, welcome. It's a pleasure for Rick and I to welcome you to the conversation. And Rick, do you want to hang out with us and we'll both just ask a couple of questions. I know you've got a hard time out this afternoon, Senator, so we'll be very respectful of your time with that. But why don't we just pick up on the conversation? You know, we just heard from Sue Gordon and Brad Smith, and some of the observations that Rick and I were making about their conversation was that the private sector does often act as first responders. So what needs to happen sort of legislatively, as Rick mentioned, and Rick, you might even ask the question better than I do, but to give those first responders in the private sector some kind of cover from liability issues that could come out of first responding?
Well, it's great to see both you and Rick, and let me, you know, maybe not fully reveal, but as I go through some of these ideas, Rick has been one of the people giving me the input and helping as we sort through this. And before I answer that specific question, though, let's step back. And I know I didn't hear all of Brad's presentation today, but I have heard it a number of other times. I do think that we inside of government and with our adversaries don't really have yet a clear definition of what our red lines are. I mean, if we say on one end we have, you know, classic espionage, country X goes against country Y and exfiltrates information for espionage purposes. At the other end of the agenda, I think most of us would agree that the NotPetya type attack, where you are literally taking down systems, critical infrastructure systems, fall much closer to an all-out act of war. So if we take SolarWinds, you know, foreign government interfering potentially into, you know, 18,000 enterprises in a much broader basis than normal, but the adversary only picked roughly 150 public and private enterprises to exfiltrate from. You know, the fact that it was a limited number pushes it closer to classic espionage. But on the other hand, when you're hitting that many entities with the potential in terms of the sophistication of the penetration, that could have been malware that could have been turned on and been used if the adversary had chosen to shut down all those systems. And obviously, when we're talking about that many enterprises affected, that puts you at NotPetya even plus levels. So can we get, you know, so it goes a little bit to this first debate, do we need to have international standards? And if we have international standards, does that mean the good guys are going to have, you know, are going to follow them and the bad guys are not? But having some greater clarity about where our red lines or at least orange lines are, I think would be helpful vis-a-vis our adversaries. And Rick and his former colleagues, you know, I think have done a good job. And I don't normally compliment the Trump administration, but one thing the Trump administration did was they allowed our offensive capabilities to be used a little more frequently. And I think that was good to show there was a price to be paid, but we still have a large number of questions around where on this line, on this continuum, and what are our red lines, number one. Now to the question you asked, number two, you know, especially as the private sector starts to become the first line of defense, and as I know has been brought up a number of times, thank goodness for Kevin, Mandy, and FireEye voluntarily coming forward on CyberWinds, or we might be still somewhat in the dark. But the traditional private sector response of, well, government, you just need to declassify stuff faster, is not a fulsome answer. Because again, as SolarWinds has pointed out, the failure to have even any level of mandatory reporting requirements is a real challenge. The fact that we still think we know how many government enterprises were penetrated, but we don't know for 100% sure, it is a challenge. So what I think the ODNI is looking at, and what our committee is looking at, is there another model that we can take, and this builds upon Rick's last comments. Can we create a National Transportation Safety Board type model where we put private sector partners, the big cloud providers, the cybersecurity first line firms, with some elements of government co-located in a way where both they have the ability to share information without antitrust violations, and the ability, as Rick said, to have some level of what's the word I'm looking for? Quick, Rick, help me. It's immunity. Some level of legal immunity. But I think we are talking about, what at least we're thinking about is, can we create this mid-incident sharing system that might not get to the full questions around my failed 3-year efforts to get national cyber breach legislation passed, that would be more a real-time incident sharing with a mandatory requirement, with a limited immunity, so that we could pulse the system, public sector and private sector, to determine if something bigger than we think is going on, and then respond to it. What I don't want to do, though, with that the immunity provision, though, is make it do 2 things. One, give an indication that, gosh, when a first-tier country tries to go against your defenses, chances are they're going to be successful. So we have almost a cyber fatalism. I don't want people to resort to saying, well, I'm not even going to try to stop things that I can't. And I also don't want to excuse the behavior. I always point out the Equifax issue, where you've got just plain sloppy cyber hygiene. Equifax should not be excused in a future venture from, well, I reported to this NTSB type model and suddenly I'm home free in terms of immunity. That is a bridge too far, because that will encourage more bad behavior. So that's a long answer, and I apologize, but it's where we're thinking. And I hope as we get into some of this conversation, we can talk about the fact that since the bad guys have figured out, maybe if they launch some other capabilities from domestic servers, we may not be able to bring our A team to the table, makes it even more difficult.
Yeah, and Rick, you're going to talk with that shortly about that very issue with Glenn Gerstel, who's the former, of course, general counsel of the NSA, on if there were only some more opportunities to wed the capabilities of the NSA and give them the authorities, or any entity the authorities, to look inward, what the clear benefits could be from that. Rick, I mean, I think what Senator Warner laid out obviously makes a lot of sense in this environment, and this environment is changing very, very fast. Is that something that you feel like will work from the legislative side?
You're asking me about legislation?
I'm just asking you if that's what you need. I mean, your background at NSA, and we're just having a friendly conversation here.
Yeah, I love the NTSB idea. I think that's a great idea, and I think that if you, as you said, have it to where it's got it's a civilian organization, non-governmental, but has governmental connections, that's the right approach, where that protects them from the penalties that come with disclosure. And the thing about liability protection in the private sector, in my experience, is twofold. One, when companies share with government, if they do it incorrectly, or if they do it to the wrong part of the government, then it invites regulation. The regulators jump on that information and they run with it. The other thing is that there's the if the government has the information, then all the government can have the information and can do anything they want with it. It's kind of the what I'll maybe unkindly characterize as the FBI exception, where we need a way to limit that so that information provided in this way to this entity for this purpose can only be used for that purpose. It can't be expanded. And I'm not sure what the chances of getting legislation like that passed are, but that would be huge in this case.
Well, I actually think there is, whether it's SolarWinds or Hafnium, I think there's a growing recognition of the breadth of this problem. I think we dodged the proverbial bullet with SolarWinds because the bad guys were more for classic exfiltration, but the level of sophistication of this attack amongst cyber experts was pretty damn good first year, obviously. But there is a bipartisan consensus. Number one, I think it may come out of the Intelligence Committee, which has got a little bit of a record of being bipartisan. And I think that there is a acknowledgement, if we can tailor that limited liability protection, that coupling that with mandatory reporting, we might be able to thread that needle. We are not, I mean, the place where I still believe that companies, that if the SEC, if a breach is material, it needs to be reported, and the question becomes how they determine that materiality. I still think there ought to be cyber expertise on public company boards. I mean, I still think there ought to be national data breach legislation. But those battles are long, have been fought for over and over and over again. And this idea of this, incident reporting with limited use of that information, to make sure that we can, have all the first responders, private sector and public sector, kind of real-time informed so that we can, shut down these massive incursions real-time and not be in the dark as we were for so long with SolarWinds, I think is a very powerful argument. Now, that still begs the question of, you would want this mandatory for government contractors, you'd want it for critical infrastructure, how you define that universe, how you define what trips over into this incident reporting, size and scope wise, where the devil's in the details, and frankly is to get the ability of having our A team, which where Rick worked for decades, engaged in this process, raises a lot of authorities questions that we're going to have to sort through, because I just don't think, and again, as Rick already indicated, no disrespect to our friends at the FBI, but the FBI by its nature is never going to be the information sharing enterprise. It is a law enforcement enterprise, and it is always going to want to do more with the information. CISA, I think, is developing, but a question of whether it has the full capabilities right now, although I know you may have Chris Krebs on this and he will get mad at me for saying that, and CISA has come a long way and we wanted to even go further. But sorting this through, and I think that the question is, we are trying to move very aggressively on this because, as we all know, when things are hot for a while on the Hill and you have these moments of people coming together, and that is the case at this moment in time. But I also think, unfortunately, it's not like SolarWinds and Hafnium are going to be the last major level hacks by foreign adversaries into our systems.
Senator, let me just follow up on that real quick, and then Rick, I'm going to let you ask the last question, if you don't mind. I want to get a little bit personal for just a second and just ask you, Senator, where were you when you first heard about SolarWinds, and what was your kind of initial reaction? Because this was the biggest thing that any of us have heard about who have covered cyber in the cyberspace for a long time.
Well, I think it was, I heard when I was up on the Hill and I got up and I picked the phone, and I've worked and have a lot of respect for Kevin Mandia, called Kevin Mandia, and there was definitely a holy crap moment. And that is my tuned down, politically correct description. And, you know, I then did reach out to my friends at Microsoft, reached out to friends at Amazon. And what struck me was that how much we were in the dark for as long as we were in the dark. And for a while, I really think because CISI was being, the Senate Intelligence Committee was being very aggressive, reaching out and touching all these folks, that we may have had more information than any other part of the federal government. And the fact there was nobody in the federal government really coordinating this. Now, I think Ann Neuberger has you know, stepped in from the administration standpoint, is doing a good job. But part of, again, the problem has been, particularly during the Trump administration, when cyber was, at least on how we figure this out on a defensive basis, was de-emphasized and people were taken out of the White House. We may have gone too much the other direction now, where we're creating lots of cyber expertise, lots of places. I'm anxious to see what Avril and the DNI does with the CTEC reimagining, and what the new cyber office is going to look like from the cyber solarium legislation. But there was both a holy heck moment and this moment of, gosh, my committee being aggressive is good, but we shouldn't be the most knowledgeable part of the federal government. There ought to be somebody, as you know, that I ought to be able to call this chair to give me the complete story.
Pulling
and
it
I
all
think,
together.
yeah, and when I talked to General Nakasone, they were, there were lots of American companies who have a relationship with the NSA were talking there, but he readily acknowledged that even getting all the public enterprises to report was still a challenging endeavor.
Yeah, Rick?
Senator, I wanted to change gears just a little bit and ask about the Solarium Commission. Last year's NDAA, they got some stuff into law, but there's still quite a bit of legislation to go. What do you think the chances are of that legislation making it through the Congress?
Well, Angus King was our member on the Solarium Commission, and got lots of friends on that commission. I think they did really good work, and I think Angus is very committed to getting as much as possible of the balance of their recommendations into our Intel authorization bill, and then if we have to ride on NDAA again, and I'm hopeful. Now, obviously, part of the recommendations goes back to the national standard on a cyber breach notification, and I'm again, I've still got the scars from 3 or 4 years of bipartisan efforts there. And it wasn't really bipartisan. It wasn't really a partisan issue at all. It's each industry. And I think about I was a telecom guy for 25 years before I got into politics. Each industry wants a carve out. And frankly, one of the groups that most hurt the earlier efforts to get, broad-based, data breach notification were my telecom guys who, but not only wanted a carve out, but then lots of battles about who they would report to if they did have to report. So I'm supportive and will be Angus and others wingman on that. But in the interim, I'm hoping that, this NTSB incident notification entity with the limited liability may be at hand and might get us 80–90% of the way there, that the total national cyber breach legislation would be geared at as well. Matter of fact, the ability to kind of mandatorily report for key items and jointly share, I think, is even more powerful than the cyber breach legislation as a standalone, because if you just simply, to Rick's earlier point, if you simply share with an entity in government, and that government's thinking in a regulatory basis, not in a how do we put out the fire right now, we may not get that fire put out as timely as we should.
Yeah, Senator, I know we only have you for about 5 more minutes or so. Let me just, in closing, pick up on something that you mentioned, which is a frustration that I hear over and over, which is there are so many different departments, areas of expertise, authorities. We're dealing with a government today that has agencies that were created when there was not a threat like the one we're facing now, and they're trying to adapt. Is there a better way forward? And that's a much broader question that goes beyond the Hill, but is there a better way forward for us to think about this in the cyberspace and how we are prepared and can earlier identify the next SolarWinds?
Well, I still think, and I know some of my friends, from the NSA world don't fully agree with this. I think aspirationally, having an international set of cyber standards and what the red lines ought to look like is an understanding. I think we have, for a long time, our unwillingness to kind of punch back against our adversaries because we were so afraid of cyber escalation was not necessarily the right posture to have. We need to be clear to the bad guys, if they cross these lines, there will be consequences, and these consequences will be dramatic, and they have to pay a price. In terms of the question about government having lots of different entities trying to sort this through, that's fair, but I would also say that the private sector, depending on the enterprise, may have this has emerged and developed to varying levels of sophistication, in a very uneven basis, company to company. And I, again, not to kind of think back that this is going to be some panacea, but the idea that if you could put the governmental and private sector expertise in a co-located enterprise, and there's some conversation of maybe housing it at FFRDC, which again gives it quasi-governmental but not really governmental, and it may get at some of the concerns that Rick was expressing earlier, that so it is that entity coordinating it, not a government regulatory entity, and making sure all the right parties were there. That might start to give us the clarity that we need. Now, on top of that, we are going to need, there is going to need to be, and this battle will go on, I think, for some time, a senior voice at the White House who has the ear of the president, whoever he or she may be, and keeps cyber as a top priority. This is is from these conferences to the fact that we've got 38,000 unfilled cyber jobs in Virginia, average starting salary of about $88,000. This is a growth field, and I don't think there's any short-term solution that's going to get us entirely out of the woods. But I do think we ought to take advantage of the moment and see if we can put some points on the board in a bipartisan way. The good news is this is not a partisan issue. If you saw our SolarWinds hearing a month or so ago, there was virtually not a member that didn't show up, that didn't acknowledge there was a problem, that didn't acknowledge there needed to be some level of mandatory reporting. And interesting enough, all the private sector entities, as long as Rick pointed out, as long as they feel like they've got this limited liability protection, all agreed to that construct as well.
Yeah. Senator, I really want to thank you. Rick, thanks for staying in on the fly. I tend to throw things at you unexpectedly, and you just take them right in stride. Thank you both. I think these comments, we have this ongoing thread of conversation through the rest of today and then tomorrow. I think lending your expertise and your very unique perspective to this as being kind of a leader on this issue on the Hill for a number of years now is very valuable to the conversation. So I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. And, obviously, having Rick as your colleague on this, everybody in the industry knows and respects Rick. And, looking at you've literally had on this 2-day symposium kind of the who's who of the cyber world. Frankly, if we could just get all your speakers, maybe not even a Zoom room, but in a real room, and spend 3 or 4 hours, I think we could probably hack out or sort through some of the the legislative challenges we've got as we try to put out a piece of legislation that would move the country forward.
You're after my own heart on this, Senator. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you so much.